but I also had Margaret Mead as one of my professors. One of the fascinating things about my graduate work at Columbia is I had both Margaret Mead, who needs no introduction, and perhaps was the most famous, at least the most famous woman anthropologist, in some respects the best known American anthropologist of the mid-20th century, and Philip Mosley, who was a political scientist, historian, and who had spent his career researching the Soviet Union and was very much involved in Russian studies. But curiously enough, in the 1930s, he had spent time in the Balkans doing studies of rural peasant families and the construction of extended households. Now, exactly how this happened is a kind of long historical story involving the interest of the Social Science Research Council, which offered him a grant if he would go to the University of London and study anthropology for a year. At that time, Mosley was an up-and-coming assistant professor. What I didn't know was the very strong relationship between Mosley and Margaret Mead, which will combine the perspectives of politics, political science, history of international relations, but with a rather strong interest in the peoples of Eastern Europe. And it was at Professor Mosley's office that I encountered a Serbian ethnologist who had been given a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship before World War II, but he could not take it up because of the advent of the Second World War, during which he lived in Yugoslavia. There's a long story there. But the point was, between Professor Mosley's pre-war experience in the Balkans and Professor Filipovich's ongoing role in Yugoslav ethnology, it seemed to open up a fascinating world for me. A world that was not totally unrelated to my world of exploration of the natural history of Ontario, combined with, in 1949, when on my own as an undergraduate, I visited Lapland. It was a kind of add-on to a bicycling tour through the Youth Hostel Association of cycling over the Swiss Alps and related parts of Italy and France. But I chose, after that was over, to hitchhike north into Sweden and make my way up to Lapland, where I spent several weeks involved with Lap culture. It's part of my life. It's fairly well documented through an article I wrote and through photographs. But this idea of going to a frontier, of going north, of pushing into the unknown, combined with a concern for history. So this humanities orientation, history orientation at the same time with natural history aspects led me into investigating the village of Orshats in central Serbia. It must be remembered that at that time, in the early 1950s, there was a huge amount of money being spent not only by the Department of Defense, but about foundations for research in Russian society, and supposedly to gain some understanding about Soviet politics. And I did have the option of joining a Harvard-based study interviewing Russian DPs in the U.S., and on the basis of those interviews to construct what Soviet society was like. But the idea of interviewing people about their life histories and political events that they had experienced did not appeal to me particularly. I wanted to get some first-hand experience. Therefore, finding this village to study, which I was aided by Professor Filipovich and by a UN expert in Yugoslavia who had experience with what was then in the 1940s and 50s called community development, a kind of multi-purpose approach to helping villages modernize. In the early 1950s, Shumadia, central Serbia, had been through the agonies and terrors of World War II, but it was also still a very vibrant peasant society with a very strong traditional component that still existed and had not been destroyed by war and revolution. It perhaps somewhat strengthened by wartime experiences and by defeating the Germans. I must say that one of my most informative experiences in Orshas was meditating about the utensils with which we ate. At that time, the Yugoslav government, with their nascent industry, was producing some fourth-class kind of utensils from aluminum that bent and broke and so on. But this family had preserved the kit, carried by a German soldier. The soldier was probably was killed in the fighting. But anyhow, this was stainless steel. And what a contrast between the two. And one of the things that I reflected on quite a bit is that this must be a rather unusual people to have defeated among the most mechanized armies in history, even though the technological equipment that they had was severely limited. Perhaps a situation not totally unrelated to the highly technological wars that America has been pursuing in Southeast Asia, and in which I have had some direct involvement by being there while parts of the fighting was going on in Southeast Asia.
So just